Good afternoon. My name is Jolie Pettit and I'm the General Manager of Corporate Affairs, Sustainability and Member Engagement at the ARA. We have more than 300 people registered for this webinar, so thank you for joining us, and I'm sure you will find today's panel discussion to be very interesting indeed. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, wherever you may be. For me, based in Sydney, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's event is the first in our 2021 webinar series, and I would like to thank and acknowledge our series sponsor, Frauscher, for their continued support for this program. So today we are here to talk about decarbonising rail. This is an increasingly topical issue as the industry considers greater use of hydrogen to reduce emissions across passenger and freight operations. But how far off is a move to hydrogen in the Australian market? And what do we have to do now to make sure the rail industry is best supporting a move to net zero emissions over the coming decades? These are the questions that many rail businesses are considering at the moment as we look at the industry's role to combat climate change. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the insights of our panellists today on this issue. Before we get started, just a reminder that this is an interactive session and we will be taking questions for each of our panellists. If you have a question at any time during the webinar, please just pop it in the questions pane. You can see this on the control panel to the right of your screen, as you'll be seeing in the screenshot displayed at the moment. And if you would like your question directed to a specific speaker, please just note that when you submit it. So on to today's proceedings. I'm delighted to welcome our four remarkable panellists for the webinar today. Alan de Reuck is the Director of Strategic Projects at Alstom. Alan is responsible for Alstom's strategic business development across Australia and New Zealand, including for hydrogen trains. He is an active member of the Institute of Railway Signal Engineers and has worked in the industry for more than 3 decades. His experience spans signal engineering, rolling stock and train protection systems and program and project management. Renene Windsor is the Energy Leader for New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory at Aurecon. Renene is an energy specialist that has worked for more than 20 years across the global energy industry. She's also worked on greenfield and brownfield power generation projects in both Australia and overseas. This work has given her visibility across the entire energy supply chain, from renewable energy generation, storage, network transmission and distribution, through to end users such as transport. She is now working with organisations to help determine how they can power and fuel their assets in a decarbonised net zero future. Bart Symes is the General Manager of New Energy at Lochard Energy. Bart has over 15 years of experience in utility scale power generation in Australia and international markets. He is currently responsible for transforming the midstream gas storage business into one that offers electricity firming and hydrogen refuelling infrastructure. Bart has previously held roles with Downer, General Electric, Vestas Wind Systems and Caterpillar Global Mining. And finally, Tibor Schwartz is a Senior Advisor at Queensland Investment Corporation Global Infrastructure. He joined QIC in early 2017 and now manages 19 direct assets with $15 billion in funds under management. He's focused on asset management strategy, driving sustainable improvement in operations, innovation and assessment, and the selective adoption of emerging technologies across the investment portfolio. So we've got a very impressive lineup to share with you today. Now, to set the scene for today's conversation, Alan will present a case study on the hydrogen-powered rail network developed by Alstom in Germany. The network has been in operation since 2018 and provides some useful learnings for us to consider today. So please join me in welcoming Alan.
Thank you, Jolie. Let me start off by saying it's certainly a great pleasure to be presenting here today on a topic that has so much relevance and importance across the globe. And of course, importantly, how we as a rail industry and community can play a key role in the reduction of fossil fuel driven carbon emissions. Next slide, please. We could, of course, spend many hours discussing the way forward. However, today, we're going to be looking at the need for alternative propulsion technology the present and the future, touch on the production requirements, reflect on the present Corradi Island operations in Europe, and, time permitting, a short video clip. Next slide, please. So, introduction of the hydrogen economy obviously requires a holistic approach, not a singular approach from one particular party. So why do we even look at alternative propulsion technology? We see a rising price of fossil fuels. Lower diesel sulfur requirements in the interim will continue to drive costs on an upward spiral. Tackling climate change, future-proofing, diesel pollutants, diesel banned in the future. A typical example in Britain, where all new diesel cars will be banned by 2040. Even locally, there are large corporations presently dependent on very substantial annual supplies of diesel. They are looking to be operating in a complete diesel-free environment by 2030. From a macro perspective, how can governments assist? Clear and consistent policy around decarbonising will drive associated industry outcomes. There must be a clear driven need for change. A good example of this in the UK, as I mentioned before, there is a policy around diesel emissions, and in this particular case, no more diesel trains from 2040. So how does this tie in with the broader industry commitments then in targeting government objectives? Clearly, trains are a key user of hydrogen and they're predictable. This in turn will drive further industry investment in this area. We'll talk a little bit more on this in the slides to come. Next slide, please. So rail has an absolute key part to play in this particular area. We are the least polluting means of moving people and freight in large quantities, with hydrogen being a key enabler to decarbonising rail networks and reducing the reliance of fossil fuels such as diesel. Just a quick reminder on some of the key objectives of the Paris Accord of 2015. There was an agreement of 195 member states of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Limitation of average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial level. Lowering limits of greenhouse gas emissions and peak of emissions before 2020, which is now passed, thankfully, and 50% reduction every 10 years thereafter. Doubling of renewable energy every 10 years and negative emissions if turnaround cannot be achieved by 2040. Next slide. There will obviously always be a need for trains to carry their own energy with them, as is the present case with diesel train operations. It is imperative that there's surety for operators around the reliable performance of their trains, particularly around routes and autonomy security. With a high cost of rail electrification, around 2.5 to 4 million capital cost per kilometre, along with the OPEX for maintenance thereafter, it is obviously not economical to fully electrify all networks. Of course, where there are high revenue yielding operations such as high speed and suburban operations, the capital investment is justified. However, across lesser used lines and freight operations, there's a strong case wherein autonomous and sustainable trains can play a vital role in securing future network operations. Next slide. So how does the future look? I guess the key question today is hydrogen operations in rail networks are at a relative infancy stage, largely similar to the introduction of the diesel trains in the first half of the 20th century, is how to firstly get the hydrogen for production to the refueling site, and then how to securely store it on site. There are, of course, numerous ways of doing this. Presently, the fuel is transported in liquid form by truck, being more economical than gas due to liquid tanker truck, being able to hold a much larger hydrogen mass. This is then vaporized to high pressure gas at the distribution site. Dependent on demand, of course, the opportunity is always there to produce and store the hydrogen on site through the use of green energy and electrolyzers. Next slide. So Karate Island, I think the important message on this slide is that the technology is not futuristic, the technology is here and now. Karate Island, as was mentioned in the opening discussion, has now been in full and reliable passenger service since 2018. It makes use of an intelligent onboard system to effectively manage the onboard energy provided primarily through the use of fuel cells with a small support lithium-ion battery. This ensures maximum autonomy and distance capability by intelligent use of the hydrogen energy on board. From a maintenance perspective, the maintenance of hydrogen trains is not overly onerous or intensive, but similar to the standard DMU maintenance cycles. The source of pressure used for the island is 350 bars. This is buses or trucks or other commercial vehicles. Whereas in cars, as there's less space, the hydrogen is stored at 700 bars. So it's not unusual requirement. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to fully load the hydrogen on the train. And just to give you an example of what can be carried on this train, travels between 140 and 160 kilometers per hour maximum speed, and it can carry around 160 people seated and 160 people standing. So full complement of about 320 passengers. Next slide. As mentioned on the earlier slide, hydrogen trains are key and predictable use of hydrogen. So if for an example, an operator was in a position to provide surety to the industry that it would, at a particular site, need, say, 3 to 4 tons of hydrogen per day, 365 days a year, the incentive would be there for the private sector to invest accordingly. Thus, we begin to create the overall system approach to developing the broader hydrogen economy. The island presently carries in excess of 200 kilograms of hydrogen, and it has an autonomy of between 800 and 1,000 kilometers. Next slide. Of course, procurement decisions made today have a major impact in the medium term, as trains typically have a lifespan of around 30 years, quite different to the lifespan of a car, which is sometimes 2 to 3 years in today's environment. But certainly, if you're taking those sorts of procurement decisions around purchasing trains, consideration always has to be at least around 20 to 30 years. These significant opportunities around the effective planning of hydrogen infrastructure in both development and deployment, as the slide indicates. Complementing different modes of transportation as a means of amortizing costs, rather than considering one transport mode only implementation. In the example I mentioned before, where the key offtake user and predictable user through a train utilizing hydrogen, once that investment is made from the private sector, certainly that investment can then be utilized for refueling vehicles other than purely trains. Next slide. So there should always be a need to strive towards a green economy with no carbon emissions from any primary source of hydrogen production. As mentioned previously, there's an opportunity to create and store hydrogen on site, dependent on demand. A typical example for wind farms, where one wind turbine of 2 megawatt can supply hydrogen for 5 island trains running around 350 kilometers per day. There's usage of solar farms. And with the storage on site, noting that wind turbine energy is not used for 2/3 of the operating time. And this is where the capture or the development of the hydrogen is so important in that particular area. Next slide. Of course, hydrogen is by no means new, as the fuel has been produced for many years, principally through steam reforming, so-called blue hydrogen, and coal, so-called brown hydrogen. These methods of hydrogen production, however, usually use electricity from fossil fuels, and thus to be carbon neutral, must use carbon capture and storage to offset the resultant greenhouse gases. Next slide. Importantly, hydrogen can play a key role in decarbonising the rail sector, as I mentioned before. Hydrogen train homologation testing in the Netherlands, for an example, used pure green hydrogen as its fuel source using electrolysis. Hydrogen also, of course, can play a key role in sector coupling, with, for example, wind turbines when the wind blows, plus solar when the sun shines, to hydrogen, including the storage. So the opportunities are certainly significant and they're exciting. Next slide. As the slide depicts, imagine the carbon reduction that can be achieved through train transport as a primary means of reducing our carbon footprint. This particular slide only depicts a story of a tiny fleet of 1 to 15 hydrogen trains. Looking at a more global scale, imagine the potential reduction of carbon emissions is absolutely enormous. Next slide. To date, since the introduction of the island into full revenue service in Germany in 2018, homologation exercises have been completed in various other countries with further interest across 5 continents.
The environment is one of today's main issues, with all societies being concerned. Alstom has for years taken part in the environmentally responsible approach of developing comprehensive, non-polluting solutions for the sector of rail transport. Today, rail operators mostly use diesel trains to operate passenger service on non-electrified networks. Now, Alstom offers a CO2 emission-free regional train and a silent alternative, Coradia iLint. Powered by a hydrogen fuel cell, its only emission is steam of water and condensed water, while it operates with the lowest noise levels. Alstom is one of the first manufacturers worldwide to develop a passenger train based on such technology. Thanks to this technology, Coradia iLint enables sustainable train operation while its performance matches that of regular regional trains. Coradia iLint is special for its combination of different innovative elements: a clean energy conversion, a flexible energy storage capacity, and smart management of the traction power and remaining energy. The principle relies on a fuel cell, which produces the electric power. It's the core of the system. The fuel cell is supplied with hydrogen on demand. By combination of hydrogen with oxygen from ambient air inside, the fuel cell produces the electric energy needed to supply the vehicle. The efficiency of the system also relies on the storage of energy in high-performance lithium-ion batteries. They accumulate the energy not immediately used in order to later supply it as needed. This results in a better efficiency of the fuel consumption. Alstom has also designed a smart power and energy management system in order to instantaneously deliver power wherever needed in the train, resulting in greater independence of the vehicle. Since the electrical energy produced by fuel cell or recovered from braking is intelligently managed, Coradia iLint matches the range and performance of similar conventional regional trains, but with nearly no impact on the environment. To make the deployment of the Coradia iLint as easy as possible for operators, Alstom provides a complete offer consisting of the train itself, its maintenance, but also the whole hydrogen infrastructure out of one hand. Alstom develops Coradia iLint in partnership with renowned German and Canadian companies boasting many years of experience in the fields of hydrogen energy and batteries. This synergy around Coradia iLint enables Alstom to introduce this technological breakthrough in the near future. As early as 2018, the first Coradia iLint will be effectively in service in Germany. Today, with Coradia iLint, Alstom is taking a considerable step towards the rail of tomorrow.
So just to conclude this very brief discussion this morning, with hydrogen trains already in service, there's no doubt that this technology is a proven alternative to traditional propulsion methods. In addition, early integration trials of hydrogen trains into operator networks significantly reduces the time taken for full implementation. With governments around the world setting policy and legislation to mandate the decarbonising of the relevant transportation sectors to achieve the all-important carbon reduction targets, we over here in Australia find ourselves in a uniquely privileged position to act early, to implement these needed changes into our networks in a planned and systemic way. However, I'll leave you with this thought. This window of opportunity is short, and it's now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was very insightful. It's good to see examples of this technology up and running, and it really shows what is possible. I would like to bring our additional panellists in to join us for the next stage of the discussion, and while they're getting their cameras up, just a reminder to everyone, we are taking questions. We're getting a few coming through already, so if you have questions at any time, just pop them in the questions pane of your control panel and we will get to them towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to start by bringing in Renene just to reflect a little bit on the Australian and New Zealand context. Renene, you're obviously looking at, you're working with clients across the industry, hearing what their thoughts are and what their ambitions are in this regard. What are the sort of trends that you're seeing, and how are you working in this space at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Jolie. So in Australia, we're already seeing significant advancement in low emissions in generating energy. So the big uptake in renewables, solar, wind, and more recently batteries. However, in other energy consuming sectors, such as the heavy transport, heavy industry and heating, the journey is a bit less advanced. And it's probably the decarbonisation in these sectors that's going to become a more urgent challenge for us in Australia. I just start out by sort of saying, like, decarbonising any market is hard, and part of that process, you need to look at all of the options. So if we're going to decarbonise transport, then there really aren't that many options available in this space, and this is especially true for diesel-fuelled passenger rail and freight. So this, as Alan just said, is really the space where hydrogen can play a future for rail in Australia. I mean, we're seeing internationally that due to increasing global climate change and political drivers, especially at the moment, the reality is that this space is moving quickly across the world, and we can see the projects that are up and running across the world. Australia, to a large extent, is probably in a bit of a bubble in this respect. And if we try to maintain the status quo and don't transition, then there is a really real risk at the moment that we could become a politically stranded economy. And that's, I guess, some of the drivers that I'd just like to quickly cross to cover now. We know the Australian economy is largely dependent on exporting our resources, the minerals. So there's decarbonisation pressures from many of our export partners for the resources, which means that the international resources market is really moving towards, we need to be able to deliver a zero carbon product to the market. And this means we have to look at the whole supply chain. And we need to be able to transition our freight infrastructure to be able to support this. The reality is that we've probably only got about 15 years to adapt and be operational with this to be relevant still in that export market. You also, if you look at the supply side of the market of the equation, and in particular fuel security and resilience risk, we also know that Australia is really dependent on diesel imports. Now, during May last year, there was a period where Australia only had an 18-day supply capacity of diesel fuel. This poses a significant risk for an economy that we're so reliant on exporting our resources. Hydrogen is a fuel source, as Alan explained, that can be derived through a chemical process. This is really a unique opportunity for us in Australia to be able to create a fuel supply chain wholly within Australia's borders and our control. That would give us a huge advantage in reducing reliance on overseas supplies on liquid fuels and increase our local fuel security. So it's very quick, but you can see there are both supply and demand side pressures and opportunities for a reason for us to consider hydrogen as a fuel in the future for rail. I'll probably end with something Alan just touched on at the end there too. There's something that we can start doing in the short term. One immediate way that we can start getting ready for this future state is by considering the future readiness of any new infrastructure. All of us that work in the rail infrastructure infrastructure space know that it's a long lifetime of these assets. So it's really important when we're considering any future rail infrastructure that we look at future transitions to alternative fuels or technologies and whatever they may be, and start including them in the planning for any new infrastructure. And that's something that we can all start doing now.
Thanks, Renene. And I think it is good to have that short-term view as well as the long-term view. I'd like to sort of bring Bart into this now and look at that longer-term view, though. Obviously, if we are going to be sitting here in 2030 with hydrogen in the market, we need to start doing some work now. What needs to happen between now and then to make this a success, Bart?
Yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. None of this moves quickly, and so if you have an ambition or a goal to start to clean up this sector, you need to start now, and you need to start in a rational place. So the first thing I would say is people from all parts of the value chain need to get together and collaborate on this. And in the absence of any clear target or any clear regulation, the collaboration should start and continue anyway, because it's going to be needed, and one day there will be targets and regulation, I'm sure. And by getting together, you get to focus on the most rational places to look. Now, what are the places, what are the areas on the network that are going to drive the most successful uptake of renewable hydrogen and cleaning up this sector? So you need to get together as a value chain and look at it. And that process is lengthy. So just as an example, so people appreciate this, if it's completely greenfield, which means that you're really starting from a blank canvas, and that's not always the way, but let's just assume it is for this example, you get together with the 4 major players in the value chain and you collaborate on where is the low-hanging fruit. You'll lose 6 months alone in that process. Then you'll embark, as an infrastructure developer, owner, operator, will embark on finding the best land for this and signing up landholders associated with this infrastructure. You could easily lose 1.5 years in that process, so you're at 2 years. And then you'll start the environmental work and the engineering work as you head towards development approvals. And you'll lose several years, at least 2 years in that process alone. So now you're at 4 years, and then you're heading towards financial investment decision, which will need the rolling stock to be in sync with you, all of the O&M support to back that up in sync with you. As you head towards financial investment decision on the infrastructure, you'll easily lose another 6 months, if not 12 months in that process there. So you're roughly sort of 5 years before financial investment decision, and then you have to build it. And the building of this is large-scale wind farms, solar farms, the hydrogen infrastructure itself, and you're looking at 1.5 years at least for that process there. So you need to start now in 2021 if you want to see a hope of, in a greenfield, through a greenfield lens, if you want to see a hope of renewable hydrogen trains in this decade. That's the reality of it. So there is pressure to make a start, otherwise there will not be a dent in this by 2030. Now, there are some ways of expediting that slightly with some existing assets, some existing wind farms and solar that might already be established, but you can't accelerate it that much. So the work does have to start now.
And I suppose the work has to start now for a range of reasons, one of those being looking at finance and investment. Tibor, investors are continually now looking at sustainability issues as a huge criterion looking at long-term asset investment. How is that changing how they're looking at transport and what does this mean for the rail industry?
Thank you for that question. What I would like to touch on here is that just to first of all explain to you who we represent. We as Queensland Investment Corporation have 25 clients that represent some of the largest pension funds, sovereign wealth funds globally. These 25 institutional clients have over $3 trillion actually as a combined capital pool. Under our current management is 15 billion, and that is growing. And the reason I'm starting with this statement is that there is this enormous capital pool that is looking for being invested in a long term in infrastructure, and no one today would invest in infrastructure that is not 100% aligned to sustainability. And cleaning up different sectors around the world is a very core, I would say, investment motivation for everyone, and that it works in a role of fund manager like we are. So if you start with that, there is a lot of capital looking to be invested. There is a lot of sectors that need cleaning up. This whole process takes a long time, as Bart touched on, and as Renene touched on, there is also a significant body of work already has taken place in Australia that we understand very well that we've got a very good renewable energy generation potential that to date has been used mostly for cleaning up the power generation sector, but now we can apply it to new sectors such as transportation. And moving on to the point that Alan raised with Alstom, and with really looking at it from perspective of rolling stock, those solutions already exist here. So if we want to be, if we don't want to become stranded as a country and be used as a poor example of not being able to move decisively in the right direction, what we need to do is we need to create attractive investment propositions for these large pension funds around the world that are very prepared to come and invest in this country. And they are very prepared to support the transition of the economy to be in line with the leading economies around the world that already have a net zero target. Japan has a net zero target of 2050, so does South Korea. China has a target 2060. European Union has a target of 2050. When you look at all the major economies around the world, if we want to live and we operate in a global marketplace, unless we clean up every sector of the economy, we will render our economy uncompetitive in terms of exportation. The fact that we are any goods that we are getting to the rest of the world and which makes this country prosperous, we rely on the fact that the rest of the world is adopting targets when it comes to net zero. And that means that, for example, European Union is currently bringing in a so-called cross-border carbon settlement, which means that any goods that will be exported in the future to the European Union will be looked at in terms of the carbon intensity of the production process. Now, that means that as a part of that production process, if it involves transportation, and in many cases it does, unless we find a way to decarbonize transportation in this country, we will be directly impacted in terms of our global competitiveness if we are trying to trade with the rest of the world. So from that perspective, there is a very large institutional capital appetite. There is an amazing renewable energy potential that we have in this country. QIC actually operates the largest portfolio of renewable energy generation in Australia currently. We have, across our portfolio of 19 assets globally, we have a deep interest in hydrogen. In the US, we already have been instrumental to operating over 40,000 forklifts that run on hydrogen, zero emissions. In Australia, in December last year, our investment on the West Coast, Pacific Energy, is one of the first assets that is operating a hybrid microgrid, which has a hydrogen, a green hydrogen, as a key part of that solution. We have in our investment portfolio really forward-thinking, amazing teams in organizations such as Lochard Energy that truly can be instrumental to decarbonizing transportation. But we need to be moving decisively. It is going to take a long time, and we need to have ambitious targets. Because for this global capital to really find its home in Australia, it needs to be something that is ambitious of enough for them to focus on this country. If the European Union has, and they have, they really focus their post-COVID-19 stimulus program is very much the green plan they put in place has a massive hydrogen component to it. Unless we can create an investment plan that is ambitious, I think the technology players and the investors will focus on those markets where the rules are clear and the investment programs are ambitious. So we've got a great opportunity, but we need to now back it up with some real plans as to what we focus on. And I would say transportation is a huge opportunity to do that.
Well, and I think as we're looking at a post-pandemic recovery and the options for that, now is the time to be ambitious, I suppose. Look, I just want to start with thinking about where we are now. And Renene, you sort of talked about the importance with this long-term infrastructure planning of making sure that we are, I suppose, thinking about embedding opportunities for sustainability and modernisation over the life of an asset. We've got a huge wave of rail projects going on in the country at the moment. What are you seeing in terms of that planning and that thinking happening already?
It's not that forefront of mind, I think, for most of the people. A lot of the plans too, especially that we see in New South Wales, it's metro, right? It's electrified. So it's not going to be relevant for the electrified rail. We've got to really, for hydrogen, it's going to be around that regional passenger rail or freight. And it's probably an avenue that could be explored more.
And just I'll pick up on that regional aspect. We recently, just this week actually, released our Fast to Rail report, which was talking about the potential for fast rail lines to the regions. Is there opportunity, as we're considering those sort of big projects, to look at hydrogen as an option for those sorts of projects, do you think, Renene?
Yeah, it should be. I mean, obviously, it is complex, and it's probably that holistic view that needs to be taken into consideration. When we talked then about a national driver, there is the 2019 there is a national hydrogen strategy, right, that was released by the chief scientist Alan Finkel at the time. So there is a clear national ambition that it's not that prescriptive on how to do it, but it does highlight all of the opportunity in this space, and it will be a mix of various things that makes that successful. And regional rail is definitely one of them to be considered.
Alan, just coming back to you, you've shown us the experience overseas of how this can work. What's been your experience locally? Is there an appetite for this here when you talk about what you've done overseas? Is there a bit of excitement about that? What are your impressions at the moment of where we are at?
I think hydrogen is always really exciting and everybody's really interested, I guess. To backtrack just a wee bit before we get to answering that question, I think Australia is an extremely complex environment insofar as train operations are concerned. These are all, there's different track gauges all over the place. There's a mix of standard, broad gauge, narrow gauge. There's different types of trains, there's different types of rolling stock, etc. In the comparison with Europe, I think the homologation efforts there are a little bit more simplistic than what it would be over here. But certainly there is definitely an excitement around the broader industry, especially around operator organizations, around what hydrogen can bring to the table. And I think if you capture that thought and that enthusiasm around the need to decarbonize, not only in the heavy mobility sector, but in the overall transportation sector. So we're talking today principally around trains, but lots of different transportation models are looking at hydrogen as well. Cars, for an example, we're all going to have to decarbonize at some stage or other. We have no other way. So we all need to migrate into that particular space. So I think the short answer is we're a little bit behind as far as Europe is concerned today. But as I mentioned on my last slide over there, we do have the unique opportunity to address this right now. And we can then be extremely competitive as far as the operator is concerned going forward, rather than waiting until something happens and we have to react. So we can be very proactive in that space.
And Bart, you were very compelling in your case for being proactive in the short term and starting to act now. If you were sort of thinking about the first or the best opportunities that we could look at in the short term to get things started, what would you be recommending?
Well, to Alan's point, and I'm not the expert on this, but Alan's closer to it, and certainly a lot of people in the audience are. I do recognise that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the way Australia's rail network is designed. So that becomes the first factor, I guess, that needs to be considered. So if you were going to, understanding what constraints exist is an important beginning point. But then thinking about you want to try and find the best bang for buck. So you're doing this for the purposes of mitigating CO2. So you want to find and focus on an area where it's going to make an environmental difference. That's number one. And number two is you want to find an area where the right synergies are there, and avoiding those constraints is one of them, but the right synergies are there to drive the lowest possible cost of adoption and the lowest possible cost of ownership of that asset. So that's an extremely important one. Because of this is predicated around renewable energy, access to the renewable energy, in particular renewable energy behind the meter, as we describe it, which means that where you've got your infrastructure to produce the hydrogen and to dispense the hydrogen, ideally you want to have your renewables actually behind there and not be taking 100% of it through the national electricity market. Because if you do that through the poles and wires, it adds cost to the final delivery of the hydrogen. Now, that will be necessary to some extent to take some from poles and wires, but you want to take as much as you possibly can from behind the meter projects. So you need to understand where the constraints are, try your best to avoid those. You need to find a place where it's going to make an environmental difference, and you need to find a place that is going to give rise to economic synergies and advantages as you go. And that's what I meant earlier by the low-hanging fruit. And once you've identified that, in the absence of strict policy or strict regulation in this domain at the moment, I'm quite confident that with the right proponents, from the rolling stock provider to the asset owners to the infrastructure providers and so on, by collaborating and focusing on an exercise like that over a 12-month period, if they march into the office of ARENA, which is responsible for grant to help get infrastructure and projects like this off the ground, with that level of credibility, the credibility of having all the players in the room, being able to articulate that you've found the low-hanging fruit and this is going to make a difference to the environment, this is therefore a logical place to begin, I can say that you will almost certainly receive ARENA funding to help make this happen, because you've just proven that this is the logical place to start. And what I think will actually happen in Australia is it'll be projects like this in a sector such as this that gets ARENA funding and starts to get the ball rolling. And once politicians can see that this is doable, and this is clearly where we have to head, and that the proponents are on board and so on, I think this will be the beginning of less grant funding and more regulation around this is where we must head with targets. That's the way I think it will unfold. But I think it will take leadership actually from the corporate sector to actually get in there, piece it all together rationally, get it off the ground with some funding, and that will give rise, I think, to greater pull-through and greater political support in the future.
Tibor, just on that, leading it from the corporate sector, are you seeing, among the organisations that you deal with in the course of your job, that there is a will from the corporate sector to really drive this kind of agenda?
I think there is a very strong will, and for investors that we, for pension funds and for other investors that we serve as our clients, there is a huge focus on everything to do with sustainability. With literally every asset under our management, we are actively working on how to think about reducing Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, with a view that this is one very strong trend and we have to be an active and proactive participant in that. I think there's a lot of corporate players that will be users of transportation infrastructure that will also strongly should be leveraged here. In the US, for example, with those hydrogen forklifts I mentioned, they are running in warehouses of Amazon, DHL, and Walmart. Walmart has a massive program how they're looking at a particular reduction target, which is self-imposed, on how much CO2 they're going to take out of their operations over a period of time. And they are instituting the change of the whole supply chain to make that happen. And one of them is the operational warehouses. So to me, this is a shared responsibility between the users of transportation infrastructure, between transportation infrastructure operators, between investors, and also between governments, because There is, to your question, there is, I think, a lot of appetite and support, but there is also a bigger play here to consider. Over a long term, currently Australia is the second largest exporter of natural gas in the world after Qatar. It's a sort of $50 billion a year business for this country. And if you think about the net zero emissions future in Japan and other countries, where we are currently exporting fossil fuels, that is not going to last indefinitely. If we don't build a thriving market for the large-scale usage of hydrogen in the domestic market, and I could think of no better examples than railways and the heavy truck transportation, we will find it very difficult to get to the cost point for hydrogen to be internationally competitive to actually export hydrogen in a 10 to 15 year time frame to energy importing countries. So there is a very strategic imperative for Australia to really drive strong the adoption of hydrogen in different domestic markets to decarbonize them, to build an investment platform to be an internationally recognized exporter of hydrogen. So there are some very strong drivers here, I think, across the spectrum of stakeholders.
So Renene, if we assume we have that corporate intent, I mean, Tibor's been talking about quite a collaborative effort with the corporate sector, with wider industry, and it needing to be a whole of supply chain issue. How do we develop the pathways to make this happen for regional lines or for freight? I mean, is there a model that we need to adopt to make sure that the industry is all pulling together in the same direction?
Yeah, it is that openness, I guess, and collaboration. If you look at the energy generation, where we have seen progress now, we have not had clear policy or decisive policy in that space in Australia, but it's come along anyway because of that private and developer drive, and we see it at a state level more, but it was even prior to that. It was the private investors and developers that got it off the ground. So I think they will talk when they need to, because it's not a case of people sitting back waiting for a clear policy or regulations. I think we'll get in and do it anyway, like we have in energy generation.
And are you seeing any barriers to that? I mean, I imagine there's some complexity with existing infrastructure and the long-term nature of assets. What are the things that we need to overcome in order to make progress?
Yeah, I guess it is understanding that urgency, and we are in a bit of a bubble in Australia, so we need to realise that the rest of the world is moving on this, and if we want to remain relevant, then we do have a sense of urgency in needing to follow the rest of the world in this. And as Tibor said, there's huge potential for Australia to become the leader in this and hydrogen export, and what that could do in the future for the Australian economy could be enormous. So it's understanding that opportunity and committing to it.
Now, just changing pace for a minute, we are having a lot of questions come through around the technical aspects of the hydrogen trains that Alan showed in his presentation. So Alan, can I just get you to give me a bit of an overview? Have you noticed any differences in performance? Have there been any specific challenges in transitioning to hydrogen? And what's been the experience compared to more traditional rolling stock?
Yeah, so I think, really good question, and obviously lots of excitement around the technology. So I think if you backtrack just a little bit, I think when Alstom would really focus on the development of a train that would operate on something differently, and obviously Alstom has quite a huge portfolio of trains, so we don't only do hydrogen trains, we do battery trains, we do electric trains, we do high-speed trains, we do trams, we have the full portfolio of product. But certainly from a hydrogen perspective, when the development was taking place, probably started around 2012, 2013, the design requirement was always to try to keep things as simple as possible, but also to keep the operating environment almost the same as what operators are used to. So operators are quite used to managing diesel fleet. They know exactly how to refuel. They know where they refuel. The drivers know how to operate against that or how to drive against that. So when we did the hydrogen development, it was developed in that same way. So in general terms, the train rocks up at the refueling site. It attaches a hose, it folds it up, and off it goes. And then it's autonomous for 800 to 1,000 kilometers, as I mentioned before. So from a technology perspective, stepping away from the refueling cycle and the operating cycle, when you look at the technology, it's extremely important. One extremely important point is you do not want trains to break down in your network. So you want to ensure that the requirements of the train meet the operator's objectives. The last thing the operator wants to consider is trains breaking down and how do you manage those trains breaking down in their overall operating network. So the importance is to manage your energy on board in the best possible way. And through that, I think I mentioned very briefly, and I said the discussion today is very short, but I'm quite happy to get questions from others by email or whatever the case might be. But certainly the energy management, so the complementary support system I spoke about before, using lithium-ion batteries on board, was a calculated measure to make sure that you use your energy as efficiently as possible between what you can store in your lithium-ion batteries and the usage of the hydrogen on board. So typical things like using regen power, knowing exactly where your train is, knowing the amount of people you're carrying, knowing when you're going uphill, when you're going downhill, when you're braking, when you're accelerating, all those sorts of things become quite complex. And what we've tried to do then is to implement a robust energy management system that takes into consideration all those things. So what you get is you get security as far as your distancing is concerned, and you also get security around not knowing that you're not going to break down and having to have some retrieval sort of mechanisms in place. So I think it's a complementary system. The fuel cells, the hydrogen tanks, the lithium-ion batteries, and then the energy management system is vitally important.
And we're also getting a few questions around the manufacturing process and the industry here in Australia. I mean, if you were looking to make a move to bring hydrogen trains to Australia, is there a manufacturing opportunity to do that locally?
Yeah, good question. And that's always a good question. Obviously, the answer is yes. There's no major issue as far as manufacturing is concerned, but volumes have to stack up. So the business case always needs to be around not only the technology, but the economics around it as well. And having mentioned before that there's complexities around gauges and train types, there are also synergies. So there are various areas of our country that do have very similar environments. So amortizing that requirement and getting the volumes that are attached to that make the business case so much more achievable.
And just on that, Renene, you mentioned the supply chain issue around diesel imports and that sort of thing. One of the things that the ARA did last year was we surveyed people about the impact of COVID, and the overwhelming majority of our members that responded talked about looking for more Australian suppliers and content to shore up their supply chains. I mean, is this a real growth opportunity as well if we get it right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, but it's a growth opportunity, but the risk is that we're so reliant on it, and especially in the world at the moment, in the last few years, it's probably the most unstable it's been on a geopolitical sort of platform where, I mean, our economy would pretty quickly come to a grinding halt, right, if we didn't have those fuel imports. So being in a position where we would be self-sufficient and not reliant on that would be a huge advantage for us as an economy. And then, as you said, I think it was Tibor said before, once you get that basis, like you grow from it then, and then we shift more and more becomes economical to transfer to hydrogen. So it's the idea, it's similar with the renewables. You know, renewables are being developed at the moment with all the red zones and everything about the demand from the generation side. But if you factored in what you could get then, if you took in the scale of with the transport and other decarbonising the other sectors through those renewables, then you get a whole different scale and economies of scale in that as well.
And Bart, just to finish with a difficult question for you, you said if we want hydrogen-powered trains in 2030, we need to start now. How confident are you we'll see something in 2030?
Well, I think that's up to everybody in the audience, honestly. That's a question we should be asking everyone in the audience, because it'll only work when you have people motivated to come together. They've got to put resources aside in 2021 to start coming together as a value chain and saying, okay, where do we logically focus? And that's all that's required for 2021. And if people do that, then by the end of this calendar year or by early next year, you will be able to make credible applications to ARENA with the sort of support that is required to go on the development journey and to give companies like Alstom the confidence that they should also be focusing on the homologation for trains for Australia for this sector and all of those sort of reinforcing things. And with that, you've got a chance of turning soil on the infrastructure on these sorts of projects in 2025 or 2026. You build the projects and you get hydrogen flowing at the back end of it. So I'm confident it can be done. I'm just hopeful that people in the audience, it resonates with their leadership sufficiently to say, let's get the right people together. Let's make a focus group. Let's start to look at this, because clearly this is, with or without regulation, clearly this is where the world is heading. This is where the world must head. And what the important message I want to convey is that it's extremely complicated to solve. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of capital between there and even building the asset, let alone the investment in the assets. So in order to do that, you need to get the right people together in 2021, have a focus group, come up with a plan, get some support funding so you can actually get on with development. And then you'll be showing the low-hanging fruit to all those that matter when it comes to financing this, and you've got a good chance of getting it away. So I'm confident it can be done. It's really up to everybody to come together to make it happen.
Well, and certainly, I think there's a great many opportunities in the rail industry to support that collaboration. So here's hoping. But look, it's certainly been an interesting discussion. We've had a huge response to this issue and a huge amount of questions that we haven't got to. So if you did send through a question that we didn't get to, we will pass those on to the speakers, and we will look at some additional content around these issues in the near future for you. But thank you very much to Alan, Renene, Tibor and Bart for your time today. I know it takes a lot of time to prepare for these discussions, but it's certainly been a very valuable one. And I hope that the people joining us today have really enjoyed it. Thanks again also for your questions, and please do look out for other webinars that we have coming up, either through our website or through the weekly update. We're regularly updating with new events, so please just stay tuned for any updates there. I'll also encourage you to join us in March for the launch of our next research report, which is the Rail Supply Chain paper. Now, this report is going to provide a snapshot of the businesses that make up the rail industry, and also the challenges and opportunities that we need to look at to support the long-term success of rail in Australia. So this is a really foundational report, and it will be informing the development of a rail supply chain blueprint over the course of this year. So that is now available for registration on our website, so make sure you secure your place and be part of that discussion on the 16th of March. Thanks again to our speakers. Thank you again to Frauscher for their support for the ARA webinar series. Have a lovely afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.